So this is a great example of a trade that is a longer term trade, and you did have to sit through. I mean, look at here. You closed this week here at 1785, but for a minute, you had to spike down to 1758, and then they zipped up. But the bigger part of this and the more important part of this is that you're holding for substantial gains. You're not trying to trade for 2 points. You're not trying to scalp the market. The skill set required to scalp the market is high. It's not low. And when people just talk about, just buying 15 times a day to try to get their 2 points and stuff, it's lunacy. The skill set is very high to be able to do that consistently. And I don't have to tell you that. You know that. I used to, a long, long time ago, think that might be a good way to do things. But I long since understood the difficulties of that, because as you get down to smaller and smaller time frames, you're getting more and more complexity coming at you. Plus, you have more and more larger forces that can play havoc with your trade. Even if your stuff is telling you that a certain thing's going to happen on your little infinitesimally small chart, that's the smallest force. You're trading at the smallest force level in a room of only larger forces. So that can play havoc. So a person who puts a trade together like this, where there's maybe 60 points of gain or 70 points or whatever it is, that's a lot of money at the end of the trade. And you're not going to lose this amount of money in your next trade. You've been in a trade that has a real swing to it. So you're not going to be holding on to a losing position for $7,000 or $8,000 on a single contract here in gold. Your next trade might lose, but you might only lose $1,000. And you might lose again in another 1,000. But then if you have another swing type of trade, you could be up any number of amounts. And it's very difficult to go backwards when the gains are significantly larger, as opposed to trading 2 by 2, which is I risk 2 points to make 2 points, or all of these things you hear people say, which they never think it through before telling you, as if they're an authority. Never risk more than what you're going to make. That doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make sense. Never risk more than what you're going to make. So in other words, if you're going to make 2 points in a trade, don't risk more than 2 points. Well, when you're down at that level, you're scratching either way. I mean, it's just 2 points. But when you get into larger moves that are going to happen, you might be risking 10 or 12 points or 15 points in order to make a large gain here. Now, I'm not saying that I want to risk 80 points to make 80 points, but let me put it this way. Even if there isn't a condition you trade it that way, I don't think it makes sense to say it, because there are conditions in the market where you might have to risk 12 points, some condition, to make 6 or 7, but with a very high degree of certainty. And this goes back to my long-standing argument that people really don't understand what risk they're talking about. Really don't. The only thing people think about when they say risk is the dollar amount they might lose. That's not the real risk. The real risk is whether you're right about what the market's going to do. When that risk is addressed properly, the other static dollar amount risk is in its right place. But when all you think about and ever talk about is what's the risk? Well, I'm risking 3 points. That it's almost meaningless, because you haven't addressed if the trade is going to be correct and the risk involved in the trade being correct. I don't know if that is making sense, but it certainly makes sense to me, having been through all this. The real risk is the risk of being wrong in the trade. That's the risk, and you have to address that. I have to address that. And then the static dollar amount that you are putting at risk becomes much more, it takes on a whole nother meaning, because it's likely that you're not going to have to lose that, since you took care of the real risk, which is the risk of being wrong. You know, my old story, somebody comes to you with his 10-to-1 trade and he says, you only have to risk 1 point, and you make 10 points. How bad can that be? And every trade he gives you loses 1 point, all of them. So now you've lost 10 points. Okay, so what was wrong? What was wrong was he wasn't really taking care of the fact that the trade needed to be correct. He was just saying, well, look, the risk is really small. It's 1 point. And if you get it right, you get 10. See, he wasn't, the risk, the static risk isn't what was meaningful, because you lost 10 times in a row because he wasn't focusing on the trade being correct, or didn't know how to try to make it correct, or whatever it was. So I do hope that you'll make, you know, some ground on that. The whole premise about, you know, how large your stop should be and all that stuff all comes into very much clear focus when you've kind of solved a portion anyway of being correct. Once you're pretty sure you're correct about the move, then the distance of your stop doesn't have the same thing. I would have no problem risking 12 points to make 8 if I knew that the 8 had a super high probability of happening. The 12-point static risk wouldn't be a big deal because the odds of me getting stopped out would be very small. So that's what others are not addressing. They're just looking at it as if, well, if you're wrong here, you're going to lose $300. So you don't want to, you know, if you're going to make $300, you certainly don't want to lose more than $300. That's where people are coming from. It's too statistical. It's not taking into account your ability to understand and have 1% truth in your favor when you're putting trades together. That's much more important.